pollinators are animals that visit flowers, and they visit them to get a food reward in the form of nectar or sometimes pollen. And in doing so, they get coated in that pollen, which is the reproductive material of the plant, the male reproductive material. Plants can't move around the way that animals can to go find a mate, right? So through this, again, process of coevolution, they have basically figured out how to trick the animals into doing the work for them, into moving that pollen from one flower to another so that it will fertilize that second flower. And in doing so, it allows the plants to reproduce. And so pollinators are incredibly essential for functioning ecosystems. I really can't overstate this. Life on this planet as we know it would be radically different if pollinators all disappeared. In fact, life as we know it would probably end. It's that important. And so again, pollinators, by moving that pollen and fertilizing plants, not only allow the plant to make their seeds, which allow the plant species to reproduce and spread, but many plants also package their seeds in little edible packages, like seeds or like nuts, fruits, berries, things like that. And those are designed to attract a whole other group of wildlife, like birds and mammals, to come eat them and digest the seed, and then they poop it out. The seed survives that process, and then it can germinate away from the parent plant. So these native plants are pretty clever, in figuring out strategies, not only to reproduce, but also to spread their seeds, all by using animals. And so again, without the services of pollinators, many other animals all along the food web would not have any food to eat. And that includes us. About a third of all the food we eat is the result, either directly or indirectly, from animal pollinators. So that's pretty huge if you think about it. And so that brings us to, who are the pollinators? So again, bees are pollinators, and they're pretty important ones, but wasps are also pollinators. You may or may not know that bees actually evolved from wasps. The wasps were around first. And then sometime all the way back during the Jurassic period, when dinosaurs were running around, flowering plants started to evolve and started to appear. And some wasps figured out that instead of having to go out and hunt insects, because most wasp species are predators in addition to pollinators, those wasp species figured out that they could actually get food resources right out of those flowers in the form of pollen and nectar. And that group of wasps eventually evolved into bees. So, it's kind of neat. They're related, and bees are, if you think about it, they're kind of like vegetarian versions of wasps. So bees are pollinators, wasps are pollinators. There are many fly species that are pollinators. And you might look at this animal on the screen and think, oh, wait, isn't that a bee? Look at it, it's black and yellow. But what's interesting is we're going to talk a little bit more about the whole black and yellow thing, but this is a fly that's actually a bee or wasp mimic, because, as we know, bees and wasps can sting. And so by looking like them, the fly gets a little bit of added protection from predators. And so, but anyway, this is a kind of fly called a syrphid fly or a flower fly. And there's a whole bunch of fly species that are pollinators, including mosquitoes. Now, I'm under no delusion that you're going to love mosquitoes after I tell you this, but mosquitoes are indeed pollinators. It's actually only the female mosquito that seeks out blood, and that's only when she needs to lay eggs. Otherwise, mosquitoes are feeding on flower nectar, and they are indeed pollinators. Now, thankfully, they are very minor pollinators, and there really aren't any plants that are, that they're an obligate pollinator for. So I'm not saying we should attract pollinators or mosquitoes. In fact, we should deter them. Other pollinators include beetles and bugs. These are actually two separate groups of insects. Not all insects technically are bugs, but you can see the longhorn beetle there. It's on a flower. It's actually a wild rose flower. So there are many beetle and bug species that are pollinators. Butterflies, of course, are pollinators, as you probably already knew. So are moths, like this hummingbird clearwing moth, one of our showier day-flying moths, and you can see it drinking out of a bee balm plant there. There are even some ant species that act as pollinators. This is one of them, and unfortunately, it's a preserved specimen because it's hard to get a picture of an ant pollinating, but there are a few ant species that act as pollinators. Similarly, some spiders are pollinators too, indirectly. They're not visiting the flower to drink the nectar or gather the pollen, but this crab spider here, you can see, again, is evolved to be camouflaged in yellow flowers, and indirectly, it is moving a little bit of pollen around while it's doing that. So yeah, those are the insect and invertebrate and pollinators that we have here in North America. Other North American pollinators include hummingbirds, and this is a great picture that really illustrates that idea of two pieces of a puzzle. If you look at that coral honeysuckle flower, that's our native honeysuckle over much of the eastern US, it is designed to accommodate the long beak of the hummingbird. The nectar's all the way down at the base. The hummingbird has this long beak and a long tongue with a feathery tip designed to fit right into that flower. But if you look, since we're talking about pollination, look underneath the head of that hummingbird. You can see those are the anthers, and those at the tips of them are where the pollen is, and it's brushing the chin of that hummingbird. Now, when that hummingbird goes over to the next flower on the next plant, some of that pollen is going to rub off on the female parts of the flower and fertilize it so that honeysuckle can reproduce. It's a good example, again, of how our pollinators in particular, our native wildlife pollinators and the native plants that they visit, again, are two pieces of a puzzle, and you really can't have one without the other. And then lastly, there are actually some bats here in North America. So if you live in Arizona or New Mexico or parts of West Texas, you might actually have these guys flying around. There's 3 species of bats that are nectar feeders, and they tend to visit, things like agave, cacti, things like that. And you can see the long tongue there, and they actually act as pollinators too. Because of their sheer numbers, there's about 20,000 species of bees on the planet. And here in North America, we have roughly about 4,000 of them, partly because of their numbers, but also because they are just so, again, perfectly co-evolved by their body shape, by their fuzziness, by special structures that they have on their body to move pollen from one flower to another. It makes bees probably, as a group, the most important because they are the most numerous and also the most efficient pollinators of our plants. So they're pretty important animals, especially when you go back to what I was saying about how critical pollination is for the functioning of most of the ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems anyway, on this planet that support us, as well as all the other wildlife species.